starting late. But I didn't want to lose any more momentum on this puppy. So I'm just going to jump right into where we left off last time. Thomas Ligotti's conspiracy against the human race. Wait, no, did we? Yeah, we got past this. Yeah. We got right to where he had underlined, or rather, right at the point where he had underscored Peter Vessel's office for primary methods of distraction, or rather, coping mechanisms for dealing with the position we find ourselves in, one of which was distraction. In his 1910 doctoral dissertation, published in English as Persuasion and Rhetoric, the 23-year-old Carlo Michelstetter audited the tactics that we used to falsify human existence as we trade who we are or might be for a specious view of ourselves. I said specious. Like Pinocchio, Michelstetter wanted to be a real boy, and not the product of a puppet maker who, in turn, did not make himself, but was made as he was made by mutations that, as Zapffe relays to us from evolutionary theory, must be considered blind. Thus, a series of accidents that continually structure and restructure all that exists in the workshop of the world. To Michelstetter, nothing in this world can be anything but a puppet. That's not appropriate. It's not appropriate to hiccup while reading this book. Hi, Colorful Dreams, Flaglow, and by Flaglow, High Q, Crimes in Space, Bart, Ramona. It's good to see you all. A puppet is only a plaything, a thing of parts brought together as a simulacrum of a real presence. It's nothing in itself. It's not whole and individual, but exists only relative to other playthings. Some of them human playthings that support one another's illusion of being real. However, by suppressing thoughts of suffering and death, they give themselves away as beings of paradox, prevaricators, who must hide from themselves the flagrantly joyless possibilities of their lives if they're going to go on living. So that's pretty much the point that's been being made for the last, we are only 16 pages in, but it's basically just been, how can we possibly know this terrible truth about ourselves and still take out the garbage? Insert any pedestrian routine relative to what they're talking about, what he's talking about, a pointless exercise whose only point, I guess there is a point, the point is to continue on as is, but there's nothing beyond continuing on as is. I apologize for the hiccup. I should do like a dorky laugh or something. Like I have an option. All I can do is a dorky laugh. So we're all prevaricators who must hide from themselves the flagrantly joyless possibilities of their lives if we're going to go on living. In Persuasion and Rhetoric, Michelstetter pinpoints the paradox of our division from ourselves. This is good. Man knows, which is why he is always to his life and his knowing. I like that quote. It's good. I have it highlighted. I have a lot in this book highlighted. Majority of this book is highlighted or has notes in it. At some point, you highlight so much it loses its efficacy. Michelstedter's biographers and critics have speculated that his despair of humanity's ability to become disentangled from its puppet strings was, in conjunction with accidental factors, the cause of his suicide by gunshot the day after he finished his dissertation. I'll have to look that up because I wonder what the accidental factors there could be. You complete your doctoral dissertation on the pointlessness of existence. Perhaps you did your job too well, and you shoot yourself, and then I don't really see the need for the accidental factors, I guess. Michelstetter could not accept a stellar fact of human life, that none of us has control over what we are, a truth that that extirpates all hope if what you want is to be invulnerably self-possessed, persuaded, and without subjection to a life that would fit you within the limits of its unrealities. Rhetoric, a word oddly used by Michelstetter, we are defined by our limitations. Without them, we cannot suffice as functionaries in the big show of conscious existence. The farther you progress towards a vision of our species without limiting conditions on your consciousness, the farther you drift away from what makes you a person among persons in the human community. In the observance of Zapfa, an unleashed consciousness would alert us to the falsity of ourselves and subject us to the pain of Pinocchio. An individual's demarcations as a being, not his trespass of them, create his identity and preserve his illusion of being something special and not a freak of chance, not a product of blind mutations. Transcending all illusions and their emergent activities, having absolute control of what we are and are not, we need to be in such a way that we may survive the most unsavory facts of life and death. This would untether us from the moorings of our self-limited selves. The lesson here is, let us love our limitations, for without them, nobody would be left to be somebody. Joy. Oh, hi, Warp Raven. Hi, Maddie. Bye, Warp Raven. Pavi, how are you doing? Pazuzu is in the basement. Safely in the basement. I've recently acquired some, or ordered some friends for Pazuzu. Undoing 2. The second of Zappa's 2 central determinations, that our species should belay reproducing itself, immediately brings to mind a cast of characters from theological history known as the Gnostics. The Gnostic sect of Cathardy in 12th century France were so tenacious in believing the world to be an evil place engendered by an evil deity that its members were offered a dual ultimatum: sexual abstinence or sodomy. A similar sect in Bulgaria, the Bogomils, became the etymological origin of the term buggery for their practice of this mode of erotic release. Around the same period, the Catholic Church mandated abstinence for its clerics, a directive that did not halt them from betimes giving in to sexual quickening. The raison d'etre for this doctrine was the attainment of grace, and in legend was obligatory for, by the way, like I'm sure everybody knows raison d'etre just means the reason for living. I guess I say it too. To me, when I see it, it does seem a little pompous. The raison d'etre for this doctrine was the attainment of grace, and in legend was obligatory for those scouring hither and yon for the Holy Grail, rather than an enlightened governance of reproductive plugs and bungholes. Okay. Now we're getting somewhere. Now it's heating up. Finally, conspiracy against the human race unveils itself as the darker sequel to 50 Shades of Grey, or prequel. With these exceptions, the church did not counsel its followers to imitate its aesthetic founder, but sagaciously welcomed them to breed as copiously as they could. And we all know this is be fruitful and multiply. This is the Catholic way. Ooh. Sure loved getting your ears rubbed with my beard. Well, thank you, creative. Slim, thick, skinny queen. But what don't you understand here? I'm happy to go over it. I don't think that, I think it's, I wonder if any difficulty understanding this might be your brain's defense mechanisms. Well, there's no need to try, Slim. Pretty much the point of this book is to convince the reader that the human race should stop reproducing and allow itself to die out. And it examines the reasons why. It's basically positing that should be the natural state of affairs, that everybody should recognize this. We should have gone extinct long ago because of this recognition. And part of what it's arguing right now is it's saying, the reason that we are so miserable is a mistake of evolution. That is the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of thought, the evolution of knowing that we're all going to die, not make any difference to anything. But it's also that same evolutionary, let's say, boondoggle, that same evolutionary eddy. Neither of those are great. That the same mutation that brought forth the ability for conscious thought, that then brought forth the ability to be miserable all the time because we know things that maybe we shouldn't know. We have tasted the Pierian spring. We have bitten the apple, whatever metaphor you prefer. The same mutation that allowed us to do that also bestowed us with these defense mechanisms that allow us to run rings around ourselves and keep ourselves vapidly busy so that we don't have to look into the abyss until eventually we do. Everybody does, eventually. Well, Pavi, you can go at it like there's no tomorrow. You don't have to have kids, though. Actually, and the proposal here is actually just have 2 kids. Everybody has 2 kids. And if you have 2 kids, over time, the population will net decrease. So the Gnostics, and buggery, and the Catholics who needed as many Christian soldiers 14 years from whatever time they encouraged it. In another orbit from the theologies of either Gnosticism or Catholicism, the 19th century German philosopher Philip Mainländer, oh boy, wow. Now, there's a few people that I think I think this is pretty grim. But if you read E.M. Ciorian or Philip Mainländer, they're just just go jump off a bridge right now. That's pretty much. Good night, Maddie. It's good to see you. So Philip Mainländer also envisaged non-coital existence as the surest path to redemption for the sin of being congregants of the world. Our extinction, however, would not be the outcome of an unnatural chastity, but would be a naturally occurring phenomenon once we had evolved far enough to apprehend our existence as so hopelessly pointless and unsatisfactory that we would no longer be subject to generative prompting, so we would just not want to bring children into the world. Paradoxically, the evolution towards life sickness would be promoted by a mounting happiness among us. This happiness would be quickened by our following, this is good. Sorry. Yeah, I'm remembering where this is going now. This part is basically espousing hedonism as the quickest way to arrive at the solution that life is pointless, because you can kind of look at life and say, well, if I had more money, if I had X, I would be happier or happy. And what Philip Mainländer is saying is, the best thing you can do for the species is behave as self-interested as possible to achieve that state, so that you can then realize that state doesn't exist. Anyway, only by securing every good that could be gotten in life, Mainländer figured, could we know that they were not as good. None of them were as good as non-existence. While the abolishment of human life would be sufficient for the average pessimist, the terminal stage of Mainländer's wishful thought was the full summoning of a will to die that, by his deduction, resided in all matter across the universe. Mainländer diagrammed this brainstorm, along with others, as riveting in a treatise whose title has been translated into English as The Philosophy of Redemption. See that people might see that as a hi Selkie, hi Pink Moon. Might see it as an ironic title. Unsurprisingly, the work never set the philosophical world ablaze. Perhaps the author might have garnered greater celebrity if, like the Australian philosopher Otto Weininger, in his infamous study translated as Sex and Character, he had devoted himself to gripping ruminations on male and female matters, rather than the redemptive disappearance of everyone, regardless of gender. As one who had a special plan for the human race, it's interesting, Ligotti says that. Ligotti has a short story entitled, I Have a Special Plan for This World. As one who had a special plan for the human race, Mainländer was not a modest thinker. We are not everyday people, he once wrote in the royal third person, and must pay dearly for dining at the table of the gods. To top it off, suicide ran in his family. On the day his Philosophy of Redemption was published, Mainländer killed himself, possibly in a fit of megalomania, but just as possibly in surrender to the extinction that was for him so attractive, and that he avouched for a more esoteric reason. Decide for yourself. Mainländer was confident that the will to die, he believed, would well up in humanity, had been spiritually grafted into us by a God who, I just realized I made a mistake here. Yeah, this was not decide, it was deicide. So deicide. Mainländer was confident that the will to die, he believed, would well up in humanity, had been spiritually grafted into us by a God, rather ironic. I think that he was a God-fearing man who in the beginning masterminded his own quietus. It seems that existence was a horror even to God. Unfortunately, God was impervious to the depredations of time. This being so, his only means to free himself was a divine form of suicide. God's plan to suicide himself could not work, though, as long as he existed as a unified entity outside of space-time and matter. Seeking to nullify his oneness so that he could be delivered into nothingness, he shattered himself, Big Bang-like, into the time-bound fragments of the universe, that is, all those objects and organisms that have been accumulating here and there for billions of years. It's an interesting theology. So, if there was a God, if there was an immortal God who could not die and contrived to commit deicide by basically exploding himself into all the living matter of the universe, each one of those parts could die. It was, it seems like one of those metaphors that's just like, it's interesting to think about, but, I don't give it any real credence. What do I know? But this is an interesting idea. God knew that he could change from a state of super reality into non-being only through the development of a real world of multiformity. Employing this strategy, he excluded himself from being. God is dead, wrote Mainländer, and his death was the life of the world. So God commits deicide therefore every one of us is a little chunk of God without his immortality. Once the great individuation had initiated, the momentum of the Creator's self-annihilation would continue until everything became exhausted by its own existence, which for human beings meant that the faster they learned that happiness was not as good as they thought it would be, the happier they would be to die out. So, the will to live that Schopenhauer argued activates the world to its torment was revised by his disciple Mainländer, not only as evidence of a tortured life within living beings, but also as a cover for a clandestine will in all things to burn themselves out as hastily as possible in the fires of becoming. In this light, human progress is shown to be an ironic symptom that our downfall into extinction has been progressing nicely, because the more things change for the better, the more they progress towards a reliable end. And those who committed suicide, as did Mainländer, would only be forwarding God's blueprint for bringing an end to his creation. Naturally, those who replaced themselves by procreation were of no help. Death is succeeded by the absolute nothing. It is the perfect annihilation of each individual in appearance and being, supposing that by him no child has been begotten or born, for otherwise the individual would live on in that. Mainländer's argument that in the long run non-existence is superior to existence was cobbled together from his unorthodox interpretation of Christian doctrines and from Buddhism as he understood it. Yeah. So, yeah, Philip Mainländer was definitely a dark chap. As the average conscious mortal knows, Christianity and Buddhism are all for leaving this world behind, with their leave-taking being destinations unknown and impossible to conceive. For Mainländer, these destinations did not exist. His forecast was that one day our will to survive in this life or any other would be universally extinguished by a conscious will to die and stay dead, after the example of the Creator. From the standpoint of Mainländer's philosophy, Zappa's last Messiah would not be an unwelcome sage, but a crowning force of the post-divine era. Rather than resist our end, as Mainländer concludes, we will come to see that the knowledge that life is worthless is the flower of all human wisdom. The knowledge that life is worthless is the flower of all human wisdom. Elsewhere, the chipper philosopher states, I didn't say chipper, I added that in. Elsewhere, the chipper, happy, joyful philosopher states, life is hell, and the sweet still night of absolute death is the annihilation of hell. There was no equivocation in Philip Mainländer. Compared to Philip Mainländer, Schopenhauer was a prevaricator. Inhospitable to rationality as so, but here's the thing. But here's the difference, Pink Moon. I see you're saying we either become extinct by some natural disaster or sun explosion, or we do it painlessly by non-reproduction. Pretty clear choice to me. But what if we had other choices? So, and what if those other choices did not involve extinction? Extinction. Because the propositions here are basically like, it doesn't matter whether or not we're destined to go extinct or not. That's the state we should be desirous of. Excuse me. Oh, but Yeats, Slim Thick Skinny Queen, Yeats writes like a mofo. Yeats is fantastic. Leah Evans, hello. I wasn't able to catch it all, but I caught some of Wentz, episode 4 of Wentz, and I thought it was really funny. I was gonna say something, but I didn't. But I was there. So, inhospitable to rationality as Mainländer's cosmic scenario may seem, it should nonetheless give pause to anyone who is keen to make sense of the universe. Consider this. If something like God exists, or once existed, what would he not be capable of doing or undoing? Why should God not want to be done with himself because, unbeknownst to us, suffering was the essence of his being? Why should he not have brought forth a universe that is one great puppet show, destined by him to be crunched or scattered until an absolute nothingness had been established? Why should he fail to see the benefits of non-existence, as many of his lesser beings have? Revealed scripture, there may be, that tells a different story. But that does not mean it was revealed by a reliable narrator. Just because he asserted it was all good does not mean he meant what he said. Perhaps he did not want to leave a bad impression by telling us he had absented himself from the ceremonies before they began. Alone and immortal, nothing needed him. Per Mainländer, he needed to bust out into a universe to complete his project of self-extinction. I'm never gonna be able to say that word right on the first go. Passing on his horror piecemeal, so to say, to his creation. Mainlander's first philosophy and last is in fact no odder than any religious or secular ethos that presupposes the worth of human life. Both are objectively insupportable and irrational. Mainlander was a pessimist. You think? Do you think Mainlander was a pessimist? Oh, Q, that's sweet. I get it. It's not a subject that people really want to talk about or hear about. I mean, there's already been about a dozen mentions of that in this book that basically, don't talk about pessimism, or at least be equivocal about it, because people don't want to hear unequivocal pessimists or pessimistic ideologies. It's natural. I'll hold this like this. I lost my place. Oh yeah, Mainlander was a pessimist. And just as with any optimist, he needed something to support his gut feeling about being alive. No one has yet conceived an authoritative reason for why the human race should continue or discontinue its being, although some believe they have. Mainlander was sure he had an answer to what he judged to be the worthlessness and pain of existence, and none may peremptorily belie it. Ontologically, Mainlander's thought is delirious. Metaphorically, it explains a good deal about human experience. Practically, it may in time prove to be consistent with the idea of creation as a structure of creaking bones being eaten from within by a pestilent marrow. I love it when he just throws in like these sort of almost textbook horror novel descriptions. That there is redemption to be found in an ecumenical non-existence is an old idea on which Mainlander put a new face. For some, it's a cherished idea, like that of a peaceful afterlife or progress towards perfection in this life. The need for such ideas comes out of the fact that existence is a condition with no redeeming qualities. If this were not so, none would need cherished ideas like an ecumenical non-existence, a peaceful afterlife, or progress towards perfection in this life. Is that right? Okay, so so the fact that we feel the need to posit an afterlife that we're working towards, or that we're progressing towards perfection or improvement, like those very facts catch us out. Because if we were good, we wouldn't need those things. Dr. Prince is it's funny. I just recently got some supplies for. I purchased some supplies on his behalf. Self-hypnosis. Among the unpleasantries of human existence is the abashment we suffer when we feel our lives to be destitute of meaning with respect to who we are, what we do, and the general way we believe things to be in the universe. If one doubts that felt meanings are imperative to our developing and maintaining a state of good feeling, just lay your eyes on the staggering number of books and therapies for a market of individuals who suffer from a deficiency of meaning. Either in a limited and localized variant, I am satisfied that my life has meaning because I received an A on my calculus exam, or one that is macrocosmic in scope, I am satisfied in my life has meaning because God loves me. So these are all, so the argument being made here is like the fact that we need or pursue self-help or self-improvement is in itself proof that we're all miserable. Few are the readers of Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking who do not feel dissatisfied with who they are, what they do, and the general way they believe things to be in the universe. I didn't need to say what I said. He said it immediately after I said it. Millions of copies of Peale's book and its imitations have been sold, and they're not purchased by readers who are well satisfied with the number or intensity of felt meanings in their lives, and thus with their place on the ladder of subjective well-being in the vernacular of positive psychology. Somebody is not a fan of psychology. I think his name rhymes with spaghetti. Oh my God. Right. Positive psychology, a movement that came into its own in the early years of the 21st century with a spate of books about how almost anyone could lead happily meaningful lives. Martin Seligman, the architect of positive psychology, defines his brainchild as the science of what makes life worth living, and synopsisized its principles in Authentic Happiness, using the new positive psychology to realize your potential for lasting fulfillment. Like, even the title is so saccharine. Difficult. Hi, Vinny. Call me Scott. If that's okay. I like your avatar. Yeah, Scott, say whatever. Yeah, whatever you want. I don't care. Listen to the name of that book, Authentic Happiness, using the new positive psychology to realize your potential for lasting fulfillment. Like, if that sounds like an appealing book to you, I would argue you have a problem. I just realized I'm kind of talking like Jordan Peterson. Stop it. There's nothing new, of course, about people searching for a happy, meaningful life in a book. With the exception of Sacred Texts, possibly the most successful self-help manual of all time, is Emile Coué's Self-Mastery Through Conscious Autosuggestion, 1922. Not personally familiar. I'm familiar with it. Have not read it. Hello, paper. Sorry, I'm looking at Paper's avatar. Paper, do I know your art? Did you do that? Oh, and I think actually you all know Emile Coué's Self-Mastery Through Conscious Autosuggestion, as you'll find out in a moment. Coué was an advocate of self-hypnosis. There's little doubt that he had an authentically philanthropic desire to help others lead more salutary lives. On his lecture tours, he was greeted by celebrities and dignitaries around the world. Hordes turned out for his funeral in 1926. I don't know if he's being sarcastic there or not. So, Paper, are you, you're on Instagram, are you rotting? Did you do the thumbnail for a video I did? Please remain calm. Yeah, I don't know if he's being sarcastic there or not. Oh, okay, no. Camilla. I like your art style. Coué is best known for urging believers in his method to repeat the following sentence. You ready for this? Day by day, in every way, I am getting better and better. How could his readers not feel that their lives had meaning or were proceeding towards meaningfulness by hypnotizing themselves with these words, day by day? While being alive is all right for the world's general population, some of us need to get it in writing that this is so. Every other creature in the world is so insensate to meaning. But those of us on the high ground of evolution are replete with this unnatural need, which any comprehensive encyclopedia of philosophy treats under the heading, Life, the Meaning of. In its quest for a sense of meaning, humanity has given countless answers to questions that were never posed to it. But though our appetite for meaning may be appeased for a time, we are deceived if we think it's ever gone for good. Years may pass during which we are unmolested by life, the meaning of. Some days we wake up and innocently say, it's good to be alive. Broken down, this exclamation means we are experiencing an acute sense of well-being. If everyone were in such elevated spirits all the time, the topic of life, the meaning of, would never enter our minds or our philosophical reference books. But an ungrounded jubilation, or even a neutral reading on the monitor of our moods must lapse, either intermittently or for the rest of our natural lives. Our consciousness, having snoozed a while in the garden of incuriosity, is pricked by some thorn or other, perhaps death, the meaning of, or spontaneously modulates to a minor key due to the vagaries of our brain chemistry, the weather, or for causes non-confirmable. Then the hunger returns to life, the meaning of, the emptiness must be filled again, and the pursuit resumed. There is more on meaning in the section Unpersons contained in the next chapter, Who Goes There? Perhaps we might gain some perspective on our earthly term if we stopped thinking of ourselves on beings who enact a life. This word is loaded with connotations to which it has no right. Instead, we should substitute existence for life and forget about how well or badly we enact it. None of us has a life in the narrative biographical way we think of these words. What we have are so many years of existence. It would not occur to us to say that any man or woman is in the prime of existence. Speaking of existence rather than life unclothes the latter word of its mystique. Who would ever claim that existence is all right, especially when you consider the alternative? Well, I might. I think other people might too. But I get the point. Cosmophobia. As heretofore noted, consciousness may have assisted our species' survival in the hard times of prehistory. But as it became ever more intense, it evolved the potential to ruin everything, if not securely muzzled. This is the problem. We must either outsmart consciousness or be thrown into its vortex of doleful factuality and suffer, as Zappa termed it, a dread of being. Not only of our own being, but of being itself. The idea that the vacancy that might otherwise have obtained is occupied like a stall in a public lavatory of infinite dimensions. That there is a universe in which things like celestial bodies and human beings are roving about. That anything exists in the way it seems to exist. That we are all part of being until we stop being. If there's anything we may understand as being other than semblances or the appearance of semblances. On the premise that consciousness must be obfuscated so that we might go on as we have all these years, Zappa inferred that the sensible thing to do would be not to go on with the paradoxical nonsense of trying to inhibit our cardinal attribute as beings. since we can tolerate existence only if we believe, in accord with the complex illusions, the legerdemain of duplicity, that we are not what we are, that is, unreality on legs. As conscious beings, we must hold back that divulgement lest it break us with a sense of being things without significance or foundation, anatomies shackled to a landscape of unintelligible horrors. In plain language, we cannot live except as self-deceivers, who must lie to ourselves about ourselves, as well as about our unwinnable situation in this world. Oh, yeah. Accepting the preceding statements as containing some truth, or at least for the sake of moving on with the present narrative, it seems we are zealots of Zopf's 4 plans for smothering consciousness. That is, isolation, being lives all right, anchoring, one nation under God with families, morality, and natural birthrights for all, distraction, better to kill time than kill oneself, and sublimation. I am writing a book titled The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. These practices make us organisms with a nimble intellect that can deceive themselves for their own good. Isolation, anchoring, distraction, and sublimation are among the wiles we use to keep ourselves from dispelling every illusion that keeps us up and running. Without this cognitive double-dealing, we would be exposed for what we are. It would be like looking into a mirror and seeing, for a moment, the skull inside our skin looking back at us with a sardonic smile. And beneath the skull, only blackness, nothing. Someone is there, so we feel, and yet no one is there. The uncanny paradox. All horror in a glimpse. Whoops. A little piece of our world has been peeled back, and underneath is a creaking desolation. A carnival where all the rides are moving, but no patrons occupy the seats. We are missing from the world we have made for ourselves. Maybe if we could resolutely gaze wide-eyed at our lives, we would come to know what we really are. But that would stop the showy attraction we are inclined to think will run forever. Pessimism 1. Hey, Cawthon. Along with every other tendentious mindset, pessimism may be construed as a fluke of temperament, a shifty word that we'll just have to do until a better one comes along. Without the temperament that was given to them in large portion, pessimists would not see existence as basically undesirable. Optimists may have fugitive doubts about the basic desirability of existence, but pessimists never doubt that existence is basically undesirable. If you interrupted them in the middle of an ecstatic moment, which pessimists do have, of course, and asked if existence is basically undesirable, they would still reply, of course, before returning to their ecstasy. Why they should answer this way is a closed book. The conclusions to which temperament lead an individual, whether or not they are conclusions refractory of those in world society, are simply not subject to analysis. Composed of the same dross as all mortals, the pessimist cleaves to whatever seems to validate his attestations. This fact should come as a shock to no one. There's no scarcity among us of those who want to think they are right, but also expect others to affirm their least notion as unassailable. Pessimists are no exception, but they are few and do not show up on the radar of our race. Immune to the blandishments of religion, country, family, and everything else that puts both average and above-average citizens in the limelight, pessimists are sideliners in both history and the media. Without belief in God or ghosts, unmotivated by comprehensive delusion, they could never plant a bomb, plan a revolution, or shed blood for a cause. That feels right to me. Identical with religions that ask of their believers more than they can possibly make good on, pessimism is a set of ideals that none can follow to the letter. Those who indict a pessimist of either pathology or intellectual recalcitrance are only faking their competence to explain what cannot be explained, the mystery of why individuals are the way they are. To some extent, however, why some individuals are the way they are is not a full-fledged mystery. There are traits that run in families, legacies lurking in the genes of one generation that may profit or impair those of another. Philosophical pessimism has been called a maladaptation by those who are concerned with such things. Excuse me. Hey, Lirio. This call seems indisputably correct. The possibility must be considered, then, that there is a genetic marker for philosophical pessimism that nature has all but deselected from our race, so that we may keep on living as we have all these years. Allowing for the theory that pessimism is weakly hereditary and is getting weaker. That just reminded. No, none of these words are fake. Well, all these words were made up. Not by him, though. It just reminded me. I was thinking today was the first day for me where I am here that it was above 70 degrees, above 60 degrees, above 50 degrees even. It was 71 degrees was the high today. So during a break from work, I went outside. And I saw a bee. Leela Brun, hello. And you know, when it comes to evolution, right, there are things that can happen and things that can't happen. We might, 1,000,000 years from now, no longer have a little toe, right? We're not gonna, like, once certain paths are selected through the complexity of a species, you get to a certain level, you can't undo them. Like, we can't go back and not be bilaterally symmetrical. Certain choices once made cannot be unmade for a given species, but certain things can still be changed. And I should have looked this up because there's probably I'm sure there's a really simple answer. But wasps are my mortal enemy, not bees. But what occurred to me was why a seemingly simple evolutionary mutation for bees would be for their stingers to not be barbed. So I was thinking about why on earth that mutation had not occurred, and we don't have bees who can sting without a high likelihood of dying. Now, I haven't looked this up. My guess is bees live for the hive. The individual life of a bee doesn't mean that much. And maybe it's like a tracer or something, right? Like if a bee stings you and rips, its hindquarters off, more or less, and the stinger stays in you, that may be what gives other bees the homing marker for attack this thing. In which case it would make perfect sense for a bee to sacrifice, especially worker bees, right? Sacrifices her life at the cost of possibly driving away a predator. And yet, you know what? Like, wasps don't need a tracer to be able to swarm an enemy. I don't know. I haven't looked this up. Maybe someone can look it up. And there's a helicopter. There's a helicopter coming. There we go. Okay, it's gone. We can continue. Now that the helicopter is mine, it's out of range. So, what's being posited here is if there's a genetic tendency for philosophical pessimism, should have probably been bred out. All right. Allowing for the theory that pessimism is weakly hereditary and getting weaker all the time because it's maladaptive, the genes that make up the fiber of ordinary folk may someday celebrate an everlasting triumph over those of the congenitally pessimistic, ridding nature of all worry that its protocol of survival and reproduction for its most conscious species will be challenged. I don't know that optimists are seeing themselves as put in opposition to pessimists in that way, but psychobiographers do not often take what is adaptive or maladaptive for our species into account when writing of a chosen member of the questionably dying breed of pessimists. To them, their subject's temperament has a twofold inception. 1, life stories of tribulation, even though the pessimistic cast has no sorrows exclusive to it. 2, intractable wrong-headedness, a charge that pessimists could turn against optimists if the argumentum ad populum were not the world's favorite fallacy. The major part of our species seems able to undergo any trauma without significantly re-examining its household mantras, including everything happens for a reason, the show must go on, except the things you cannot change, any other adage that gets people to keep their chins up. But pessimists cannot give themselves over to this program, and its catchwords stick in their throats. To them, creation is objectionable and useless on principle, the worst possible dispatch of bad news. It seems so bad, so wrong, that should an authority be unwisely placed into their hands, they would make a prosecutable malfeasance to produce a being who might turn out to be a pessimist. Yeah. So, I guess what he's saying there is like it's a good thing pessimists don't have a lot of motivation. At least it's good for the non-pessimists. Disenfranchised by nature, pessimists feel they have been impressed into this world by the reproductive liberty of positive thinkers who are ever thoughtful of the future. At whatever point in time one is situated, the future always looks better than the present, just as the present always looks better than the past. No one today would write, as did British essayist Thomas de Quincey in the early 19th century, "A quarter of man's misery is toothache." I do think that's pretty great. I mean, that's an undeniable, step forward. Knowing what we know of the progress towards the alleviation of human misery throughout history, who would damn their children to have a piteous toothache in the early 19th century or times before it, back in the days when Homo sapiens with toothaches scrounged to feed themselves and shivered in the cold? To the regret of pessimists, our primitive ancestors could not see that theirs was not a time in which to produce children. So at what time was it that people knew enough to say, this is the time in which to produce children? When did we think that enough progress had been made towards the alleviation of human misery that children could be produced without our being torn by a crisis of conscience? The easy years of the pharaohs in Western antiquity, the lazy days of the Dark Ages, the palmy decades of the Industrial Revolution, as well as other industry-driven periods that followed, the breakthrough era in which advancements in dentistry allayed humanity of 1/4 of its misery. But few or none have ever had a crisis of conscience about producing children, because all children have been born at the best possible time in human history, or at least the one in which the most progress towards the alleviation of human misery has been made, which is always the time in which we live and have lived. While we have always looked back on previous time and thought that their progress towards the alleviation of human misery was not enough for us to want to live back then, we do not know any better than the earliest Homo sapiens about what progress towards the alleviation of human misery will be made in the future, reasonably presuming that such progress will be made. And even though we may speculate about that progress, we feel no resentment about not being able to take advantage of it. And I underlined that and I wrote, not true. I feel quite a bit of resentment at that. I resent it a lot. I like it a lot. Nor will those of the future resent not living in the world of their future, because even greater progress towards the alleviation of human misery will by then have been made in medicine, social conditions, political arrangements, other areas that are almost universally regarded as domains in which human life could be better. Will there ever be an end of the line in our progress towards the alleviation of human misery when people can honestly say, this is without doubt the time to produce children? And will that really be the time? No one would say, or even want to think, that theirs is a time in which people will look back on them from the future and thank their stars that they did not live in such a barbaric age that had made so little progress towards the alleviation of human misery, and yet still produced children. As if anyone cared or will ever care, this is what the pessimist would say. There has never been and will never be a time in which to produce children. Now will forever be a bad time for doing that. Moreover, the pessimist would advise each of us not to look too far into the future, or we will see the reproachful faces of the unborn looking back at us from the radiant mist of their non-existence. Ah, yeah. Pessimism 2. Had enough yet? Oh, good night, Pavi. Sorry if this rubbed you the wrong way. It rubbed me the wrong way. In his lengthy study, Pessimism, James Sully, not the pilot, is that James Sully? I don't even remember. He wrote that a just and correct estimate of life is to be looked for in views which lean neither towards the favorable nor unfavorable pole. By this claim, Sully erred in his otherwise able dissection of his subject. People are either pessimists or optimists. They forcefully lean one way or the other. There's no common ground between them. For pessimists, life is something that should not be, which means that what they believe should be is the absence of life, nothing, non-being, the emptiness of the uncreated. Anyone who speaks up for life as something that irrefutably should be, that we would not be better off unborn, extinct, or forever lazing in non-existence, is by definition an optimist. It is all or nothing. One is in or one is out. Abstractly speaking, practically speaking, we have been a race of optimists since the nascency of human consciousness and lean like mad towards the favorable pole. More stylish in his examination of pessimism than Sully is the American novelist and part-time philosopher Edgar Saltus, whose philosophy of disenchantment and the The Anatomy of Negation were written for those who treasure philosophical and literary works of a pessimistic, nihilistic, or defeatist nature as indispensable to their existence. I've never read this fella. In Saltus's estimation, a just and correct view of human life would be a just and correct view of human life would justly and correctly determine human life as that which should not be. Controverting the absolutist standards of pessimism and optimism as outlined above are the heroic pessimists. These are self-styled pessimists who take into consideration Sully's unfavorable pole, but are not committed to its entailment, that life is something that should not be. In his Tragic Sense of Life in Men and Nations, the Spanish writer Miguel de Unamuno, who, I have one book of his, and I liked it. Oh, is he going to say shit about Unamuno? I think I would remember that. Unamuno speaks of consciousness as a disease bred by a conflict between the rational and the irrational. The rational is identified with the conclusions of consciousness, primarily that we will all die. The irrational represents all that is vital in humanity, including a universal desire for immortality in either a physical or non-physical state. The coexistence of the rational and the irrational turns the human experience into a wrangle of contradictions, to which we can bow our heads in resignation or defy as heroes of futility. Unamuno's penchant was for the heroic course, with the implied precondition that one has the physical and physiological spunk for the fight. In line with Unamuno, Joshua Dienstag, author of Pessimism, Philosophy, Ethics, Spirit, is also a proselytizer for a healthy, heroic pessimism that faces up to much of the dispiriting lowdown on life, all radically pessimistic visions being cropped out of the picture, and marches on towards a future believed to be personally and politically workable. Also siding with this Never Say Die group is William R. Brashear, whose Desolation of Reality concludes with a format for redemption, however partial and imperfect, by holding tight to what he calls tragic humanism, which I'm a fan of. Tragic humanism recognizes human life's ostensible insignificance, but also the necessity of proceeding as if this were not so, willfully nourishing and sustaining the underlying illusions of value and order. How we nourish and sustain illusions of value and order in our lives is explained in Zapfa's The Last Messiah. How we might nourish and sustain at will what we know to be illusions without a covenant of ignominious pretense among us is not explained by Brashear, and has never been explained by anyone else who espouses this façon de vivre, façon de vivre. Not in the same class of pessimism as the antinatalist Zapfa, Unamuno, Dienstag, and Brashear meet existence more than halfway, safely joined in solidarity with both ordinary and sophisticated folk, who take their lumps like grown-ups, and by doing so retain their status with the status quo. Attuned as they may be to the pessimist's attitude that life is something which should not be, they do not approve of it. But Unamuno, Dienstag, and Brashear's solution to the pessimist's rejection of life puts us in the same paradoxical bind that Zapfa sees in human existence, that is, living with the pretense that being alive is all right. The only difference is that Unamuno, Dienstag, and Brashear knowingly accede to a pretense that ordinary folk shirk knowing, at least as a general rule, because even average mortals are sometimes forced to admit this pretense. They just don't linger over it long enough to make a philosophical point of pride and sing their own praises for doing so. So Legati is not a fan of Unamuno, Dienstag, or Brashear, or tragic humanism. Bye, paper. Have a good night. Thank you for coming. I don't know. I'm kind of, I don't know where I fall on the spectrum of pessimism exactly. Not sure. A philosophical cohort of Unamuno, Dienstag, and Brashear is the French existentialist writer Camus. In his essay, oh, I have it here. Oh. In his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus represents the unattainable goal of the title figure as an apologetic for going on with his life rather than ending it. As he insists in his discussion of this gruesome parable, we must imagine Sisyphus is happy as he rolls his boulder to the top of the mountain from which it always tumbles down again to his despair. The credo of the church father Tertullian, I believe because it is absurd, might justly be placed in the context of Camus' belief that being alive is all right, or all right enough, though it may be absurd. Indeed, the connection has not been overlooked. Caught between the irrationality I move this stuff out of the way. Caught between the irrationality of the Carthaginian and the intellectuality of the Frenchman, Zapf's proposal that we put out the light of the human race extends to us as an antidote for our existential infirmities that is infinitely more satisfying than that of either Tertullian or his avatar Camus, the latter of whom meditated on suicide as a philosophical issue for the individual, yet did not entertain the advantages of an all-out attrition of the species. By not doing so, one might conclude that Camus was only being practical. In the end, though, his insistence that we must imagine Sisyphus as happy is as impractical as it is feculent. Like Unamuno, Dienstag, and Brashear, Camus believed that we can assume a view of life that can content us with the tragedy, nightmare, and meaninglessness of human existence. Camus may have been able to assume this view of life before his life ended in a vehicular misadventure, but he must have been jesting to pose it as a possibility or a duty for the world. So, I feel like I'm definitely a pessimist. But according to Legati, I would probably be a prevaricating, wimpy pessimist. I think I was probably more, these focal lengths are basically the same now. I put a 50 millimeter lens on the camera here that usually has a 35 millimeter lens, because I like the way it looks better right now. I wonder if having kids did that to me. I feel like when I was younger, I was more fervent. It would be a sign of callousness to bemoan the fact that pessimistic writers do not rate and may be reprehended in both good conscience and good company. Some critics of the pessimist often think they have his back to the wall when they blithely jeer, "If that's how this fellow feels, he should either kill himself or be decried as a hypocrite." I totally don't believe that. Well, he's going to explain it right here. Right? That the pessimist should kill himself in order to live up to his ideas may be counterattacked as betraying such a crass intellect that it doesn't deserve a response. Yet it is not much of a chore to produce one. Simply because someone has reached the conclusion that the amount of suffering in this world is enough that anyone would be better off not having been born, does not mean that by force of logic or sincerity he must kill himself. It only means he's concluded that the amount of suffering in the world is enough that anyone would be better off never having been born. There's a big difference there. Good day, Peep Knox. How are you doing? Others may disagree on this point as it pleases them, but they must accept that if they believe themselves to have a stronger case than the pessimist, they're mistaken. Naturally, there are pessimists who do kill themselves, but nothing obliges them to do so or to live with the mark of the hypocrite on their brow. Voluntary death might seem a thoroughly negative course of action, but it's not as simple as that. Every negation is adulterated or stealthily launched by an affirmative spirit. An unequivocal no cannot be uttered or acted upon. Lucifer's last words in heaven may have been non serviam, but none has served the Almighty so dutifully, since his sideshow in the clouds would never draw any customers if it were not for the main attraction of the devil's hell on earth. Only catatonics and coma patients can persevere in a dignified withdrawal from life's rattle and hum. Without a yes in our hearts, nothing would be done. And to be done with our existence en masse would be the most ambitious affirmation of all. Most people think that vitality is betokened only by such phenomena as people in their 80s who hike mountain trails, or nations that build empires. This way of thinking is simply naive, but it keeps up our morale because we like to imagine we will be able to hike mountain trails when we're in our 80s, or live as citizens of a nation that has built an empire. And so the denunciation of critics who say the pessimist should kill himself or be decried as a hypocrite make every kind of sense in a world of card-carrying or crypto-optimists. Once this is understood, the pessimist can spare himself from suffering more than need be at the hands of normal people, a confederation of upstanding creatures who in concert keep the conspiracy going. This is not to say that such individuals do not suffer so much and in such a way that they do sometimes kill themselves, possibly more per capita than do pessimists, or that because they kill themselves they are hypocrites for ever having said anyone is better off for having been born. It's only to say that when normal individuals kill themselves, even after having said that people are better off for having been born, they are disqualified as normal individuals. Because normal individuals do not kill themselves, but until their dying day think that being alive is all right, and that happiness will stand out the existence of life's newcomers, who, it is always assumed, will be as normal as they are. That's brutal. It's brutal. We're down. We've got 2 downvotes now. Blundering. Consciousness is an existential liability, as every pessimist agrees. A blunder of blind nature, according to Zappa, that has taken humankind down a black hole of logic. To make it through this life, we must believe that we are not what we are, contradictory beings whose continuance only worsens our plight as mutants who embody the contorted logic of a paradox. In order to correct this blunder, we should desist from procreation. What could be more judicious or more urgent, existentially speaking, than our self-administered oblivion? At the very least, we might give some regard to this theory of the blunder as a thought experiment. All civilizations become defunct, all species die out. There is even an expiration date on the universe itself. Human beings would certainly not be the first phenomenon to go belly up, but we could be the first to precipitate our own passing, abbreviating it before bodies really started to stack up. Could we know to their most fine-grained details the lives of all who came before us, would we bless them for the care they took to keep the race blundering along? Could we exhume them alive? Would we thankfully shake their bony undead hands and promise to pass on the favor of living to future generations? Surely that's what they would want to hear, or at least it's what we want to think they would want to hear. And just as surely that is what we would want to hear from our descendants living in the far future, strangers though they would be, as they shook our bony undead hands. Nature proceeds by blunders. That is its way. It's also ours. So, if we have blundered into regarding consciousness as a blunder, why make a fuss over it? Our self-removal from this planet would be a magnificent move, a feat so luminous it would bedim the sun. What do we have to lose? No evil would attend our departure from this world, and many evils we have known would go extinct along with us. So why put off what would be the most laudable masterstroke of our existence, and the only one? Of course, phenomena other than consciousness have been thought to be blunders, beginning with life itself. For example, in the novel titled At the Mountains of Madness, the American writer H.P. Lovecraft has one of his characters mention a primal myth about great old ones who filtered down from the stars and concocted Earth life as a joke. Schopenhauer, once he had drafted his own mythology that everything in the universe is energized by a will to live, shifted to a common-sense pessimism to represent life as a series of excretions. Now, quoting from Schopenhauer, life presents itself by no means as a gift for enjoyment, but as a task, a drudgery to be performed, and in accordance with this we see, in great and small, universal need, ceaseless cares, constant pressure, endless strife, compulsory activity, with extreme exertion of all powers of body and mind. Many millions united into nations strive for the common good, each individual on account of his own, but many thousands fall as a sacrifice for it. Now senseless delusions, now intriguing politics, incite them into wars with each other. Then the sweat and the blood of the great multitude must flow to carry out the ideas of individuals or to expiate their faults. In peace, industry and trade are active, inventions work miracles, seas are navigated, delicacies are collected from all ends of the world, the waves engulf thousands, all push and drive, others acting. The tumult is indescribable, but the ultimate aim of it all, what is it? To sustain ephemeral and tormented individuals through a short span of time, in the most fortunate case, with endurable want, comparative freedom from pain, which, however, is at once attended with ennui, then the reproduction of this race and its striving. In this evident disproportion between the trouble and the reward, the will to live appears to us from this point of view, if taken objectively, as a fool, or subjectively, as a delusion, seized by which everything living works with the utmost exertion of its strength, for something which is of no value. But when we consider it more closely, we shall find here also that it's rather a blind pressure, a tendency entirely without ground or motive. The world is will and representation. That's Schopenhauer for you, right there. Schopenhauer is hard to read. Schopenhauer is here straightforward in limiting his awareness that for human beings, existence is a state of demonic mania, with the will to live as the possessing spirit of ephemeral and tormented individuals. Elsewhere in his works, he denominates consciousness as an accident of life, a blunder, a mistake. Is there really anything behind our smiles and tears but an evolutionary slip-up? Analogies. Schopenhauer's is a great pessimism, not least because it reveals a signature motif of the pessimistic imagination. As indicated, Schopenhauer's insights are yoked to a philosophical superstructure centered on the will, or the will to live, a blind, deaf, and dumb force that rouses human beings to their detriment. While Schopenhauer's system of thought is as impossible to swallow as that of any other systematic philosopher, no intelligent person can fail to see that every living thing behaves exactly in conformity with his philosophy and its liberal articulation, wound up like toys by some force, whether it be Schopenhauer's will, élan vital, anima mundi, physiological or psychological processes, nature, whatever. Organisms go on running as they are bidden until they run down. In pessimistic philosophies, only the force is real, not the things activated by it. They are only puppets, and if they have consciousness, many mistakenly believe they are self-winding persons who are making a go of it on their own. So we are spring-loaded mechanisms, finely created spring-loaded mechanisms who have somehow, both come to believe that, a watch implies a watchmaker and that we are more than watches. How can those two things coexist? I believe, Cawthon, you are very correct. It is, as we mentioned, I think in the last reading session of this, the propensity to interject humor during a particularly dour passage, or whether it be a movie like Saving Private Ryan did it, or a book. Here, then, is the signature motif of the pessimistic imagination that Schopenhauer made discernible. Behind the scenes of life, there is something pernicious that makes a nightmare out of our world. It's a quote on the back. For Zapfa, the evolutionary mutation of consciousness tugged us into tragedy. For Michelstaedter, individuals can only exist as unrealities that are made as they are made and cannot make themselves otherwise because their hands are forced by the god of philopsychia to accept positive illusions about themselves or not accept themselves at all. For Mainländer, a will to die, not Schopenhauer's will to live, plays the occult master pulling out strings, making us dance in fitful motions like marionettes caught in a turbulent wake left by the passing of a self-murdered god. For Bonson, a purposeless force breathes like a black life into everything, and then feasts upon it part by part, regurgitating itself into itself, ever renewing the throbbing forms of its repast. For all others who suspect something is amiss in the lifeblood of being, something they cannot verbalize, they are the malformed shades of suffering and death that chase them into the false light of contenting lies. By analogy with that pernicious something, the pessimist's sense behind the scenes of life are the baleful agencies that govern the world of supernatural horror fiction. Actually, it would be more proper to speak of the many worlds of supernatural horror, since they vary from author to author, as much as the renderings of the human fiasco vary from pessimist to pessimist. Even within the writings of a single author, The source of something pernicious that makes a nightmare of our world switches about, the common link being a state of affairs that overturns our conception of reality for the worse. Ooh. In The Willows. Anyone read The Willows? Algernon Blackwood. It's a short story. If you've never read Algernon Blackwood, well, a lot of short stories written. So I enjoy uncanny horror short stories. Hi, Grace. How are you doing? But they kind of had like a heyday in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And I don't find that they necessarily all translate that well. I enjoy Robert Aikman. Let's see, who else? I have trouble remembering their names. Oh, I can just look at my Audible. See what's in my Audible library at the moment. M.R. James. Shirley Jackson, but she doesn't count. She stands the test of time, in my opinion. I mean, even Lovecraft, Ambrose Bierce, Edgar Allan Poe, I think, also stands the test of time. I'd have to look at the actual books I have as well. Oh, there's Algernon Blackwood right there. E.F. Benson. So a lot of people, were writing around that time, and a lot of people were writing short ghost stories that were published in magazines, and then the collections would be published in these anthologies. And I feel like a lot of those they're enjoyable reads, and I do read them, and I like them. But they tend to not be that, if they're not post-1950, so I guess we could include Shirley Jackson in that, there's like a quaintness to them, like there's a shadow, and it's behind that tree, and you don't know what it is, and that was enough 150 years ago, but it doesn't do the trick anymore. We have become desensitized. We need more and more terrible things to make us shiver, to make the hairs on the back of our necks rise. But I do think The Willows is a classic short story. And it's one of those ones where, I'm not giving anything away here, but it's one of those ones where it's like, you never see, I guess, well, no, I can't. All right, give it away. All right, forget it. Let's see, I don't remember what Legati says about The Willows. In The Willows, for instance, the 20th century British writer Algernon Blackwood suggests that an inimical force abides within nature. What this enormity might be is known to the characters of story only by the mysterious signs and sounds that unnerve them as they make their way in a small boat down the Danube and camp for the night on an island overgrown with willows, which become the symbolic focus of a region where nature shows its most menacing aspect. An occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. That's a good one. The narrator tries to explain what it is about the willows that seems particularly threatening to him, as distinct from the more immediate perils of the severe weather that have developed on the river. And now this is a quote from Algernon Blackwood's The willows, a rising river perhaps, always suggests, I'll do it in a voice. A rising river perhaps always suggests something of the ominous. Many of the little islands I saw before me would probably have been swept away by the morning. This resistless, thundering water touched the deep sense of awe within me. Yet I was aware that my uneasiness lay deeper far than the emotions of awe and wonder. It was not that I felt, nor had it directly to do with the power of the driving wind, this shouting hurricane that might almost carry up a few acres of willows into the air and scatter them like so much chaff over the landscape. The wind was simply enjoying itself, for nothing rose out of the flat landscape to stop it, and I was conscious of sharing its great game with a kind of pleasurable excitement. Yet this novel emotion had nothing to do with wind. Indeed, so vague was the sense of distress I experienced, that it was impossible to trace it to its source and deal with it accordingly, though I was aware somehow that it had to do with our utter insignificance before this unrestrained power of the elements about me. The huge grown river had something to do with it too, a vague, unpleasant idea that we had somehow trifled with these great elemental forces, in whose power we lay helpless every hour of the day and night. For here, indeed, they were gigantically at play together, and the sight appealed to the imagination. But my emotion, so far as I could understand it, seemed to attach itself more particularly to the willows, to these acres and acres of willows crowding, so thickly growing there, swarming everywhere the eye could reach, pressing upon the river as though to suffocate it, standing in dense array mile after mile beneath the sky, watching, waiting, listening, and, apart from the elements, the willows connected themselves subtly with my malaise, attacking them mild, insidiously somehow by the reason of their vast numbers, and contriving in some way or other to represent the imagination as a new and mighty power, a power, moreover, not altogether friendly to us. The mystery of the pernicious something that the willows represent is never resolved. Okay, he spoils it, so I don't have to worry about spoiling it. Hello, Fonz. Cawthon, you want the... Hi, Katharina. Cawthon, you want the good vampire video? Man, I like that game. I really did. I liked Soma better. But I really liked Vampire. Whatever. I particularly liked the feeding mechanic and the way it restricted you from killing the people that needed to stay alive, which didn't feel shoehorned in, like, frankly, it was in Bethesda games where you just, you kill lots of people, but then there'd just be these people that you just hit and they just kind of stand there and you can never kill them. Oh, that's an essential quest giver. Okay. The mystery of the pernicious something that the willows represent is never resolved. I like the word malaise too, Grace. However, at the end of the story, the two travelers see a man turning over and over in the rushing river, and he bears their mark in the form of indentations they had seen before in the sands of the island. Oh, I kind of ripped this off. I was inspired by the willows for a video that I did. God, that was last year? Yeah, last year. Cool. Funnels that formed and grew in size throughout the night the men had camped on the island. Whatever power that was not altogether friendly to us had procured its victim and satisfied itself. The men had been saved at the price of another's death. That which makes a nightmare of our world had revealed itself for a time, and then withdrawn once again behind the scenes of life. Well, such is the motif of supernatural horror. Something terrible in its being comes forward and makes its claim as a shareholder in our reality, or what we think is our reality and ours alone. It may be an emissary from the great... Look at this. And that was another one. Yeah, Arthur Machen. I did not mention. He's about to invoke the name of M.R. James. I'm sure I read these authors before reading this book. I don't think Conspiracy Against the Human Race, which I only read a few years ago. But it's strange, the convergence, and I'm sure there's something in my head that's causing that. It may be an emissary from the grave or an esoteric monstrosity, as in the ghost stories of M.R. James. It may be the offspring of a scientific experiment with unintended consequences, as in Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan, or hitherto unheard of beings in the same author's The White People. Ooh, Chambers. It may be a hideous token of another dimension revealed only in a mythic tome, as in Robert W. Chambers' The Yellow Sign. If you have not read Robert Chambers' The King in Yellow, I recommend that as well. Or it may be a world unto itself of pure morbidity, one suffused with a profound sense of doom, without a name. Edgar Allan Poe's world. Reflected in the works of many supernatural writers, the signature motif Schopenhauer made discernible in Pessimism was most consistently promulgated by Lovecraft, a paragon among literary figures who have thought the unthinkable, or at least thought what most mortals do not want to think. I don't love Lovecraft as much as most people do. In conceiving Azathoth, that nuclear chaos which bubbles in the center of all infinity, nuclear, Lovecraft might well have been thinking of Schopenhauer's will. As instantiated in Lovecraft's stories, the pernicious something that makes a nightmare of our world is individuated into linguistically teratological entities from beyond or outside our universe. Like ghosts of the undead, their very existence spooks us as a violation of what should and should not be, suggesting unknown modes of being and uncanny creations which epitomize supernatural horror. Correct Q, the KZ1742. Well, with that, I'm going to call it a night. Reading aloud takes a lot out of me. My mouth is so dry. I think I got to do it on days where I haven't been working all day and been in on meetings, talking all day. But tomorrow night, I don't know what the plan is for tomorrow night. Hopefully something good. If not something good, at least something that'll get fewer dislikes than talking about Sebastimort. So, I hope you all have a good evening, and, maybe don't take this stuff too seriously. Philosophy is all about just getting you to think about stuff, maybe in weird and sometimes damaging ways, but I'm starting to think I need to be careful. Oh, Q has something to show tomorrow night. Can I get a hint? Can I get a hint, Q? Let me guess, it's embarrassing for me. Something that will embarrass me. She found something on the web. Q found something on the web of me That's terrible. Now I have like this feeling of something pernicious. Shoot. Well, maybe we'll do tomorrow. Maybe I'll run to the hills or to an island in the middle of a river and hide amongst the willows. All right. I love you all. We'll see you tomorrow, assuming all goes well. And thanks for hanging out.